Okay, folks, why don't we go ahead and get going here. I'd like to introduce Nick Nystrom, who's the Director for Strategic Applications at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center. Nick is active in the novel and innovative projects area of ECSS, and some of the things that Nick's looking at are what the impact of big data means in terms of algorithms and how you use supercomputers to do analysis and things like that. So the data starts to take, or can take, different forms than some of the traditional data that we see generated from large-scale simulations, partial differential equations, and things like that. So what Nick's been looking at is graph algorithms, and so nodes and networks connecting those nodes, and it's a very different way of thinking about things than some of the typical analysis that you see in computational fluids or physics or things like that. So I know a number of us with architectures that are well suited for these kinds of analysis are really interested to hear about some of the work that Nick's done in this area. So with that, let's see here. I think everything is all good to go. Yep, you've got a nice sized audience here, Nick. Why don't you take it away?
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Thank you for the introduction. For those people who have signed in so far, thanks for your participation. Like Nancy said, my name is Nick Nystrom, and I've been looking at a number of novel things at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center for quite a while now. And I'd like to talk to you about really an introduction to graph analytics. I know that in XSEDE, and in TeraGrid before, we focused on high-performance computing, and graph analytics is actually quite a bit different. I think that the baseline of what people have done with it is fairly broad. So I'm going to start off an introduction to some of the terms, the concepts that will come up in the rest of the talk. I'll then move into talking some about community software and standards that are emerging to address graph analytics. And then I'll talk about the computational resources. They're available on XSEDE and otherwise funded by NSF. And I realize I won't touch on all of the resources at all of the service providers. Partly that's because my own time has been quite limited to prepare this, and I just don't have hands-on experience with other people's machines at other sites. But of course, there are many more than I will talk about today in all respects, both software and hardware. And then just a few thoughts at the end on future directions and how we can help researchers. So first, we all know, I hope everybody can see the slides. I'm now on number 3, if it helps. So first of all, big data really is everywhere. And we see on all the publications, it's spanning everything from science to business to pop culture. And what's important is it actually has many different flavors. It's not just one thing that is big data. I think to some extent, we thought of HPC as one thing. We thought of a tightly coupled machine that would solve partial differential equations well. If it did that well, it probably worked for a lot of HPC. Whereas big data has some very different flavors. We have very separable problems. They're great for Hadoop-like platforms and loosely coupled clusters. We have other very data-intensive problems from instruments. We have other problems that come from different types of sources that turn up as graphs. And so here on slide 4, I have some illustrations of that. The two things on the left happen to be two instruments. The Pan-STARRS telescope could just well be LSST or other imaging sources, and genome sequence assemblers. And these are typical of the things that generate lots and lots of data. They could be many terabytes or more per day. It's often streaming. It could be bursty. The data tends to be very structured and regular, and it's mostly independent. So it can often be processed by a series of computers or clusters and worked on very effectively. In the middle column are a couple examples from simulation. So on top, we have some NOAA climate modeling that's happening at Oak Ridge. And at the bottom, we have cosmology simulations that look at black hole formation. And so these are the we've known as HPC in TeraGrid and in XSEDE. They tend to generate a lot of data, but that data tends to be fairly well structured. It's a very well-known type. It can be HTF or NetCDF or their domain-specific format, but it tends to be regular. The analysis of that data can require coupled resources. So in some cases it may, if you run on Kraken, you may need Kraken to do the analysis, or it can be independent, depending on what the type of data is. The third column is what this talk today is about. And it is other types of data. So this can come from, the figure in the top is a web graph produced by people down at UCSD, Ross Richardson, and rendered by Fanchun Graham, of basically the web graph of major internet routers. And the bottom one is a human interactome showing an idea of protein-protein interactions in the humans. And so these are examples, one from a man-made network on top, one from a natural network on the bottom. There are other things from social networks, from text mining. These are things that emerge in various ways, and they tend to produce very large data. It's very different than what's in the first two columns. The main difference here is that the data can often be unstructured, so it doesn't have a priori defined types and schema. The data tends to be very irregular. As you can see in these diagrams, you don't have a nice 3D or 4D mesh. You have a very irregular connectivity. And in addition, it is non-partitionable. And we'll talk more later about what that means. But so that's the data we're focusing on today. Another thing about that I want to say right now, though, is that unlike the first two columns, there tends to be a lot less computation in graph analytics for each data point. And so they tend to be much more latency bound, much more dependent on memory subsystems, and much less dependent on flops.
Nick, I'm just going to mute the background noise here for you, okay?
Great, thank you.
Presentation mode is now enabled.
Okay, I'm going to go over the next few slides fairly quickly. They may be familiar to some of you, but just to set the baseline, I want to talk some about what we mean by graphs. It's certainly true that if you say graphs to the general public, they'll think of XY plots. In this case, we mean the mathematical sense of a set of vertices and edges. So in the little diagram at the bottom of slide 5, there are 6 vertices. They're connected by a number of edges. You notice that not all of the vertices are connected. That's fine. So, of course, an edge has to connect a pair of vertices. And we refer to vertices that have an edge between them as neighbors. This is a simple graph. The edges don't have a direction. And so each edge can be described just as a pair of neighbors. There are other types of graphs. So we'll focus a lot in today's talk on directed graphs, where a pair of vertices are connected in a specific order by an edge. So in this case, vertex 1 is connected to vertex 2. And later we'll see that can take the form of certain relations, and those tie into things that are happening here on machines at Pittsburgh. More generally, we can also have graphs where there are multiple edges between nodes. In some of the literature, this is called a multigraph or a pseudograph. There can also be self-loops, where there's a relation, as in the top right corner, from a node to itself. These can be directed or undirected. And the last type I wanted to talk about in this very, very brief introduction are weighted graphs. Now, weighted graphs, now each edge has another piece of data on it. And that other piece of data is usually a floating point number. It can be other things too. But the floating point number can represent things. It can represent the cost of moving along that edge, a transition probability, for example, in the Markov decision process. It could be a distance on a map. In a machine learning application, it could be the strength of a relationship between the two nodes, or the belief probability, and so on. And so again, the weights can be on either undirected or directed graphs. And it's another piece of information that is useful in doing the analytics. One more concept I want to address here is subgraphs. And the whole idea of a subgraph is that obviously a graph is a connection of vertices, and we can think of that as, we can pull out pieces of that. If we pull out a piece where we have some collection of vertices and some collection of edges from the original graph, then the new thing is said to be a subgraph of the original graph. And in addition, if all of the edges that were present joining the vertices in the first graph, so in G here, we see that all of the vertices joining nodes 1, 3, and 5 are represented in G prime, then that means that G prime is induced by, actually that's a typo. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not. So they're induced by the second vertex set. And that has importance when one is looking at partitioning graphs to work on pieces independently. And so this last few slides give us the terminology we need and some of the concepts to move forward with the rest. So where do graphs turn up? A simple example I just pulled up here is the Washington, D.C. Metro Transit Authority map. So the D.C. Metro subway. And so this is a simple graph. It's one in which each of the subway stops is a node. There's the little black circles. And the edges between the nodes are just the subway routes. What we really have here is 6 different graphs that are superimposed on each other. And these 6 graphs happen to share some vertices. And so how they interact, one can treat in different ways. One can treat it as a graph where there are multiple edges between certain nodes. One can treat it as a graph where there are 6 different graphs and then have those interact. And obviously there's also directionality on some of the routes. This could be a weighted graph if it were expressed, say, with the distances between the stops or the time to transition between the stops. And then one can do things like computing minimum path lengths, having those weight functions built in. And again, it's just a simple example, but it's one that everybody can relate to without having to come from any specific domain. The second example touches on an application that I'll talk about in a few minutes. And this one is from the Never Ending Language Learner, which is a project at Carnegie Mellon University to automatically, and there's some human supervision, but essentially to automatically read through web pages that are crawled continuously to build up a set of beliefs without any a priori knowledge of English grammar, syntax, or definitions. And so in this case, this is one very tiny subgraph from the belief network. And in here we see that we have nodes, and nodes are concepts. And the concepts are connected by relations. So I will use several terms here interchangeably. And nodes and vertices are interchangeable, and edges and relations I will use interchangeably. So here are the relations, which are the edges of the graph, are things like on the right, Bill Clinton knows George Bush. And the edge that connects them is this relationship, which is knows. And both Clinton and Bush are of type politician, and politicians, the never-ending language learner has inferred, happen to be of type person. And so that's an example of a belief network where the edges are these relationships between the nodes. The nodes are concepts. And in this example, actually, the edges have the strengths of the beliefs on each edge. So it's also a weighted graph. And so one can then propagate those strengths through and determine the likelihood of a certain belief being certain. So that leads us to the topic that we're supposed to talk to you about today. It is graph analytics. So the whole point is that we've seen that we have, in science and nature, we come up with these large graphs. They tend to be complex, and one would like to do various things on them. And that has actually emerged to be a science in and of itself. It's been around for obviously quite a long time, since the days of Euler and others. At those times, there was mainly mathematical analysis. Now, looking at realistic graphs tends to be primarily computational. One can do formal methods and proofs on various classes of synthetic graphs, various random graphs, for instance, various very regular graphs. But the graphs we're interested in science often can be close to those ideal graphs, but they always are different. That's what makes them interesting. And so the kinds of things we want to do with them are various degrees of classification, for instance, structural characterization, understanding how, for instance, different communities may be the same or different, understanding how different, if you understand the graph of a social network, you may understand how a pandemic is more likely to spread, or how friend networks are established. Other things we may want to do are looking for hidden patterns or relationships. We'll talk about that some today. But the main thing is when confronted with a very large, complex graph, clearly you can't visually see what's interesting in it. Many times they're just referred to as hairballs. But then what quantitative techniques can we use to pull out what's interesting and essentially do feature detection, and then diving into those in more detail? Another very common task is community detection. So when looking at a very large and complex graph, what can we do to identify the smaller groups of communities that are forming in it? Individuals, say, small world networks that may identify the influential parties in a social network or the cores of a terrorist cell. Another example is anomaly detection. So for anomaly detection, for instance, if we know that the normal pattern in a network of users on a computer network is that they will be connected in some fairly regular way with each other, with various sites, and then there are outliers that take the form of people who have no other connection whatsoever. Statistically, it has been found that those outliers tend to be more likely as intruders or people trying to break in. Other anomalies we may detect in large graphs are things like credit card fraud, where the behaviors are unusual relative to populations or types of customers. And the fifth example, of course, this list can go on, is inferencing. And by that I mean, if we go back to the previous example I showed, where Bill Clinton and George Bush are politicians, which are people, that involves inferencing. And so given the relationships between nodes and the relationships between them, basically how can we apply ideas of transitivity to generate additional inferences directly between other nodes in the graph? And so there are a lot of things that happen here. These require computational information that is different from traditional HPC, and that we'll go into. Now, in terms of what we want to compute, it often involves different metrics on the graph. And so in slide 13 and the next couple, I'm just going through a few of the most basic of these. It's mainly to give you a feel for the kinds of things one wants to look at. Just like in finite elements, you'd be looking at building up these interactions between the elements and then doing the solves between them. In this case, we're looking at the individual nodes and the edges between them, and the statistics of the connections and the large-scale statistics as they assemble. A lot of the literature in this, some came from math, a lot of it actually comes from statistical physics, because a lot of the techniques tend to be the same. So a few of the ones on the first page here are things like the degree and degree distribution. If the degree of a node is just the number of edges that are incident on that node. If it's a directed graph, one can have the in degree and the out degree corresponding number of edges coming in or out, respectively. And then the distribution overall, one can just compute. And these are typically computed now by doing a histogram that's normalized and then just looking and seeing what one got as the degrees for a given graph. Now, when you think about how this would map onto a large computer, let's say we're talking about a large graph that's terabytes or petabytes in size. When you think about how you would distribute that across a traditional supercomputer, what you see is you're looking at the different nodes, and depending on how they are partitioned between processors, these computations, even though they look like innocent little sums, mean that you're always going across, or very often going across, node boundaries to determine who is connected to whom and to do these computations. Moving forward, the clustering coefficient measures the tendency to form cliques. A clique in a graph is a group of nodes that are fully connected. In other words, a complete graph. If you had 3 nodes, it would just be a triangle. A clique of 4 nodes would be a square with the crosses filled in also, and so on. And so the clustering coefficient is a measure, again, these are structural characterizations. It's a measure of the tendency for that to form, and one can do that both for a given node I, or one can do it as an average sense over the whole graph. Another important concept, next slide 14, is the betweenness centrality. And so betweenness centrality really came in as a concept from social networks. And the idea here is that in a graph that may represent people or other relationships between entities that naturally form, you have shortest paths from one node to another. You have certain nodes that are more important than others. So in XSEDE, for instance, there are probably many, many paths between, if the nodes are people, there are probably many nodes that pass through John Towns because he's a central figure in XSEDE. That means that between the centrality of that node would be very high because many shortest paths between other nodes pass through that given node. And identifying nodes with high betweenness centrality, and they identified them as being key to communication networks, to being influential in social networks, and so on. And the same way one gets the betweenness distribution. Because this is now looking at all of the, first of all, you need all the shortest paths between all the pairs of nodes, which means you have to start computing all the paths between all pairs of nodes, find out which are shortest, and then find out which go through given node I at a time. Clearly, the amount of remote memory referencing that this involves is just tremendous. In a general graph that's distributed across memory, this becomes a very challenging operation, even though it's fundamental to graph analytics and so simple to describe. So there are many more metrics. Because we only have an hour today, I'm not going to go into any more for now. But I want to give you a feel for the kinds of things one looks at statistically and structurally, and we'll talk more about why that makes it hard and how we address it. As we build up these networks, there are certain types that emerge as being very important and they emerge as being very common in nature, and that's both in terms of man-made networks like the internet and in terms of natural networks like gene networks. So first, a small world network is one where most nodes are not directly connected to each other, but at the same time, most can be connected to each other by a small number of hops or a small number of edges. And so we've all heard of when you look at it, the 6 or 7 degrees of separation between any two people in the world. And it's that sort of concept, that even though the world is a big place, very few people know each other, in general, the path from one to another is quite short. The same thing applies to social networks on Facebook or Twitter, also in gene expression networks, in air traffic routes. That's why hubs exist, internet connectivity, and so on. These tend to be ubiquitous. It was a seminal paper in Science magazine some time ago that went into this. And the properties are that there tend to be many high-degree nodes. Those are the hubs in network. And there's a fat-tailed distribution, so there are quite a few nodes with high connectivity. When that connectivity takes on the form of what could be fit to a power law, that's said to be a scale-free network. And so that's the formula here at the bottom of the page, where the distribution, the degree distribution is proportional to some constant to an exponent. And in nature, that exponent tends to be between 2 and 3. It can be other things, but in most cases, it tends to be between 2 and 3. And so those tend to be very important, and they are well studied, but it doesn't mean that analytics on them is any easier. And as one of the earlier examples of things you want to do with big graphs, I mentioned community detection. I just want to mention that once more because it is so important. So in community detection, think of a large graph with n nodes, and you want to look for the communities with, let's say, m is less than n vertices that exhibit some measure of relative cohesiveness. And what that measure is depends on the application. It could be genes are somehow close together. It could be topics that are connected by literature search. It could be groups of people who are all interrelated on Facebook, or so on. And this is definitely a very important thing to do. Understanding how the communities form, how big they are, how many there are, can be important to understanding the science underlying the graph and its structure. This example where there are many, many algorithms for doing it. None are exact. They all tend to be heuristics. They all tend to be expensive. And they're based on any number of techniques, from statistics like betweenness centrality that was given up above, to looking at percolating out closely knit groups or cliques, simulated annealing. There are just many, many ways to do this. And the software we'll talk about later has different ways of addressing that. Now, obviously, whatever you're doing on these, if you're thinking about doing it on a distributed memory machine, like a traditional supercomputer, a massively parallel machine, a cluster connected by some interconnect, or what have you, you have to think about how you would split it up to actually do the work in parallel. And so to do that, you have to think about a cut. A cut through a graph is just a line that separates it, hopefully in some way to minimize the number of edges that you cut. Because if you minimize the number of edges, then you minimize the number of communications you need between those partitions to do any work. And so the cut size is just the number of edges that you have cut. I've put in two little simple graphs here. The one on the left is just a ring. In the ring, we can obviously cut it, and no matter where we cut it, we'll cut two edges. So in here, the number of vertices is 8, the number of edges is 8, the cut size is 2. That's pretty good. The cut size is much smaller than the number of edges, and so computation would be relatively local. There don't tend to be graphs like that that are very interesting in practice. The graphs are more interesting. While they may not be quite as bad as the one on the right, they're much closer to it. The one on the right, we see an example where it is heavily connected, so that's a click of size 8. In this case, we have n over n minus 1 divided by 2, times n minus 1 over 2, edges in the graph, that's 28, and the cut size, the minimum, is 18. Now, in that sense, we are traversing over half the edges in the graph most of the time. And so computation we would distribute of a graph like that would involve a tremendous amount of remote communication and remote memory references. And what's important here is that most important graph problems, in fact, are not partitionable. And so that's the key. In addition, graph partitioning in general for arbitrary graphs is also an NP-hard problem. So even if you were to try to partition it, the cost of doing the partitioning is also extreme. Now, going back to the examples I showed back on slide 3, the two graphs here, just visually, one doesn't have to look at the number of edges and count things. Just visually, you can immediately see that the difficulty of cutting these in any way to actually make a small number of edges that you have to cut is just not going to happen. If you were to try to partition these across a large machine with hundreds or thousands of nodes, you'd be cutting edges to a degree that just would not allow any sort of efficient computation. The bottom line is that these non-partitionable problems are challenging. Graph algorithms typically involve following edges from vertex to vertex. That's irregular. It's unpredictable. The nature of it means that the things that we've done for decades on HPC machines are actually exactly the wrong thing to do. So the things we've done for message passing are good when we have relatively large messages. For just graph node data, often the message overhead can exceed the amount of the payload. Arguably, PGAS languages like UPC can help. That's just part of the problem. Caching that we have in our memory subsystems is also, at best, it's ineffective. At worst, it's counterproductive if we bring in much more than we need. And the reason for that is if each node is encoded as, let's say, one integer, which is typically the case, then bringing in the whole, filling your L2 or L3, even L1, is just not going to help. And the third is that hardware prefetching will be absolutely useless because you're not going in any normal stride 1 or any regular stride through memory. And so actually doing hardware prefetching will increase the amount of memory pressure on the memory bandwidth. And so large graph problems really do need specialized architectures to be solved effectively. One thing we do find in research is that people have worked on problems that, even though they may seem large from the CS research side, compared to real problems in practice, they tend to be fairly small. And the problems we're looking at now are ones that you can't solve on a single small workstation, where the memory is much larger. And for those are the ones where we need new architectures. Before I get into hardware, I want to talk some about software because just the way they're tied together will make more sense. So first of all, there have been a number of standards and types of community software that have evolved to address these problems. Now, like I said, many of these have evolved from when the problems being solved were smaller. And so we will see some scaling issues here. First is that one can look at graphs from a semantic web viewpoint. And this is something that Tim Berners-Lee really pioneered. The point here is that he was looking at a web of information where what's on the web is not just plain HTML, but to some extent it is self-describing, say through what you can build from XML. And by being self-describing, then one can envisage a situation where automated systems can find what's out there, they can learn from it, they can adapt, and they can do things dynamically without necessarily having to have humans in the loop. The data is inherently unstructured. In this case, the graphs are expressed as, it's still nodes and edges as before, and they're directed graphs. So in this case, the originating node, or vertex, is the subject, also called, no, I'm just going to call it the subject for today. And then it is connected by a predicate or relationship to the object. So in the graph we showed previously, there was one line where the subject was Bill Clinton, the object was George Bush, and the predicate was nose. And so that was the relationship. This is a very general approach of describing graphs with these triples. And it's applicable to a lot of things, from machine learning, protein analysis, business analytics, and so on. The graph on the right is just yet another example from the literature of the Human Metabolic Network. And these look at enzyme activation in people from diabetes. Now, expressing these triples, one of the standards evolved to do this was called RDF, it's the Resource Description Framework. And in RDF, graphs are expressed, as we just showed, as a subject, object, predicate. And the whole point is that it really unifies what you can express on the web. And even though it was developed for the semantic web, the format is obviously general. It can extend to other concepts also. In one of the machines I will talk about shortly, that's extended from a triple to a quad. So rather than just having those three subject, predicate, object references, there's also a fourth field in the quad. And the fourth field is a named graph. And the named graph, the point of that is that one can have multiple graphs one's working on simultaneously. They may come from different data sources. They may come from, say, a gene sequence data source, and a literature data source, and something else. Back on the simple example I showed you of the DC Metro map, the different graphs might just be the different red, orange, green, silver routes, and so on. And so this lets us fuse data from multiple sources. By having the relationships being absolutely arbitrary, it also means we don't have any a priori defined schema. So unlike a relational database where you have to define what your rows and columns will be, each column is a relationship in that case. In this case, we don't have to know what our columns will be. We just define them on the fly. And new things can turn up as the need arises. Now, that gives us a lot of power. There are a lot of tools for converting data from RDF, and that can come from relational databases like MySQL or Oracle, from Hadoop, and from generally arbitrary things. In many cases, this can be solved by writing a simple script. The other issue is, what do different things mean? So we talked about these predicates, and a predicate was knows. In that sense, there's what does knows mean? So knows in that example came from semantic web data, but it didn't have a meaning. It was just defined from reading the web. And so there has to be a meaning associated with that. And so an ontology defines meaning on top of words. And that can also define how different sets of data are mapped onto each other. So if you had different types of data in biology, they would have an ontology that defines what different terminology from genomics means, what cellular science, other things mean. That defines a common framework. Obviously, 1 hour is much too short to go into this in detail, but so I'm covering some of this quickly. Now, once we have RDF, that gives us a format. And I just likened it to what we would do with relational databases, but as a more general case. Now, in a relational database, we have a language called SQL or SQL that we can use to express queries and to do things with that data. To deal with RDF, there is an analogous language called SPARQL, spelled S-P-A-R-Q-L, which is, to some extent, similar to SQL, but it operates on RDF data. And so it really lets one express graph isomorphisms and really to look for patterns in graphs and to pull those out. What you pull out then may be a simple result set. It may be essentially answers, like if from MySQL, or it can be other graphs, also in RDF, that would then be operated on in subsequent steps. There is an RDF version. Actually, there's a lot of RDF data on the web now, but in particular, there's an RDF version of Wikipedia. It's called DBpedia. And on DBpedia is a SPARQL engine. There's a link here on slide 23. And the point of this is that it's a convenient place to experiment with SPARQL queries and to learn the kinds of things one can do and to get some experience. As a simple example, here on slide 24, we can set up prefixes to save typing these things. Because RDF had its roots in the semantic web, all of the things in RDF are expressed as Uniform Resource Identifiers, or URIs. The advantage of that is it means that all of the subjects, predicates, and objects are unique. And if something is given a certain name once, and it turns up again, we know that is the same thing. And so that's the point of the URIs. Obviously, from here, they can be very verbose. And that's just the way it is. Now, the verbosity in practice is not a problem because when you're reading it, this is the ASCII representation for humans. And so it's unique and it's clear and we know what it means. Internally to the applications, these are represented as integers. And so there's still a concise, memory efficient, and very compute efficient mapping internally on these. In this query, we define some of these prefixes to save typing in to make it easier for the human. We do a select. Now, in SPARQL, variable names are preceded by a question mark. Unlike SQL, it's enough like SQL to make it easy to understand, and there are enough tiny differences, though, like the question marks and the semicolons between clauses and the periods at the ends of clauses. There are enough of these little differences just to keep one frustrated as you're coming up to speed with it. But so we do select, we're looking for the country name and the population from a RDF data store. where we're looking for countries that have a type landlocked countries. We're looking for countries that are landlocked, however that's defined internally. And then they have a label with the country names. We're going to pull that out as a return value. And we're also going to look for the property of population estimate, and that property is defined up in these little ontologies defined above. And then we're going to filter that. We're only going to look for the countries that have over, 15 million people. They're landlocked. In addition, we're also only going to look for the matches that the country name is written in English. And so we run that query, and you can do that on the DBpedia page that came up before, and you get a list of, I think it's 7 countries that are landlocked, and they have these names in English. And so that's the way it worked. Without the English filter, you come up with a list that's probably 30 times higher because it would have all of the same countries but written in other languages also. That's the sort of thing that SPARQL can do. We're applying it here at PSC. We have a project that's been going on for quite a while called the Never Ending Language Learner. This is from Carnegie Mellon, machine learning, run by Tom Mitchell and William Cohen and others. And this is a project that we gave an example for before, where we're reading the web. It's based on a web crawl called ClueWeb from Jamie Callan and others at Carnegie Mellon. And iteratively, it is looking for examples. It's using those entities to find patterns, like in this template, a person plays a musical instrument. That would be a pattern. It then looks for examples of that. For instance, George Harrison would be the person, plays a guitar would be the instrument, and plays here is the relationship. And iteratively then, it makes inferences and establishes beliefs. And this is the kind of thing where it determines that, well, George Harrison is probably a person, and the guitar is an instrument, and people play instruments, and things like that. And so that's the project. And the graph on the bottom shows number of knowledge base assertions. KB here is knowledge base versus time, and we can see it's going up. There was a period where human supervision kicked in, and that people started. You can go into their website and you give a thumbs up to, or thumbs down to beliefs, and let the system know whether or not it's actually doing the right thing. And so it's a semi-supervised learning process that way. The initial application of RDF here was to look at the systems of beliefs and to help disambiguate cases where the same thing occurs more than once, or to look more deeply into occasions where certain entities are specializations of other entities. At this time, at least at the time of this slide was produced, that was back in November, there are about 4.8 million beliefs in the knowledge base. It is a big graph. Now we see here's 4 nodes, really 2 million. 4.8 million beliefs means that at that time there were 4.8 million edges in the graph. So the example here is if we come up with a common phrase like Taj Mahal or breakfast cereal, does it mean one thing or is it used in different things? Obviously, some phrases like apple can mean different things depending on how it's used. So an example query, this was actually by Joel Welling, who many of you know from PSC. Obviously, real queries get more complex than what we showed before. And I won't go into this one in detail, but this is looking at a null ontology. You'll see some of these prefixes called null, where it defines some of these things. And this has now been running on the Sherlock machine here, PSC. And this is used for looking at some of these ambiguities. So these graphs were produced by running the queries that were just shown, really, and looking at things like, is a Dancitron a personal care item or is it a drug? Judging from the way it's used on the web, it's not fully clear. Both of these are specializations of product, and one can start looking into this and doing analysis on it. Similarly, if you come into the Plains Valley News and Temple News, or these newspapers or blogs, And in this case, we're looking at specialization in both newspaper and blog or publications, and looking at that in more detail. Other software that helps support this stack, and these are important because being that these are standards or W3C recommendations, it means that things like RDF and SPARQL and Jenna and Fusiki that I'm going to talk about next are not limited to the machines that we're talking about in this talk, but you can run them on anything from your laptop on up to large machines. These are Apache projects, they're open source, they have various implementations that work to various degrees, as with all open source things. So Jenna is it came out of HP Labs. This is just a framework for dealing with RDF data, for handling ontologies, for doing inferencing, for handling SPARQL, doing SPARQL coherency and consistency checking, basically handling it. So this is a module you install when you're building up Apache. It allows you to work with SPARQL and RDF data. The other piece of the puzzle, if you're building this up from scratch, is Fusiki. Fusiki is one example of a SPARQL server that gives you a REST-style web service for doing SPARQL updates and dealing with SPARQL from a remote client-server type interaction. Okay, the other piece of software I'll spend a few minutes on here is GraphLab, and this is different. This is a different approach. RDF and SPARQL are all based on triples-based data, and so those let you do certain things with graphs, but that's not all of it. A lot of the other things you want to do are these, let's say, call them whole graph analytics, structural characterization, the things with betweenness, graph diameters, community finding, all these other things. And for that, you also need other ways of addressing the data. GraphLab's a project here. It happens to be out of Carnegie Mellon, but it's installed over 1,600 sites worldwide, very widely used. The main point here is that, as we said at the beginning, big data means many things. There are data parallel tasks for which things like MapReduce are great. There are tightly coupled tasks, these non-partitionable issues, where you want graph parallel tasks, and you really want to apply asynchronous dynamic parallel computing to be able to get your answers in a reasonable time. GraphLab is a C++ library, very mature, very well developed, specifically designed for machine learning, looking at basically everything you need to do with graphs, mainly for machine learning. It's a simple abstraction where you don't have to worry as much about the hardware issues. Basically, if you know how to solve your problem, which you can do running on a laptop, you can then apply GraphLab on other systems, anything from the cartoon at the bottom, Blacklight in the bottom right, through using accelerators to cloud services to get parallel computation out of it. The framework has a graph-based data representation. Obviously, it has to do some sort of partitioning. There are user computations are defined as update functions, and those are user-defined. There's a scheduler that does the asynchronous scheduling of these across the system. And there are consistency models to be sure that things are done and you get consistent results. This is running on Blacklight. It scales very nicely there and takes advantage of the hardware that we'll talk about in a moment. We're looking now at bringing parts of it up on Sherlock, which is the other machine I'll talk about. There are also a number of tools for working with graphs interactively. I'm mentioning this because this is important. One needs a desktop interface to work with a lot of these things to get a feel for what's in there, to understand the overall issues. Two of the tools that I personally like are Gephi and Cytoscape. They're both open source and free. The point of all of these, though, is that there are many tools and they have many purposes. Their scalability varies, how well they handle rendering large graphs. In fact, they all only render up to modest-sized graphs on a desktop. And you want to do the large analytics on some back-end engine, like Blacklight or Sherlock or something else that's very large and well-suited to handling massive data. And then just ship back small views of it that are amenable both to working with on a personal system and also are amenable to being digested by the human brain and visual system. I can't digest a million nodes. I can digest this little graph from the diseasome of a few hundred nodes. They typically have plugins to extend their functionality to handle semantic web data and so on. They can be standalone clients. Some can live in a browser and give you portability, and so on. Gephi is the first of these. Both of these are on the web. I give the URLs for them. What I like about Gephi is it has a very nice built-in SPARQL engine, so it's very useful for developing queries before one scales them up to large sizes, and to get the syntax right. They're flexible. You probably can't read what's on the slide. The panel on the left, though, has to do with the graph layout. You can specify different force atlas, different types of laying out your graphs, so you can pull out the features you care about and tuning the parameters of those layout algorithms. You can do exploratory data analysis, and you can connect. The second tab in the middle window, if you can read it, says Semantic Web Import. That's a plugin, and you can use that to import RDF data, and then you can do things like connect to the SPARQL endpoint, to the Sherlock that we'll talk about, to run things using Sherlock as the backend, the graph analytic engine. Cytoscape is similar. I won't get into a lot of detail. Obviously, they can both produce very nice publication quality graphics. There's even a benchmark for graph analytics I won't go into here. So computational resources, since we're running low on time, first of all, this is an example of what I've been talking about. You have a graph here that's partitioned somehow across 4 nodes or 4 processors, P1 to P4. And what we see is we're trying to find the shortest path from node A to node B. In doing so, we end up hopping from processor 3 to 1, back to 3 to 2 to 4. And so we have a lot of traversals across different processors, different memory regions. And so what we need to handle that. The first machine of that type we had PSC. We had even older ones, but more recently, what we still have running is Blacklight. It's an SGI UV1000. And the point of Blacklight is it has 16 terabytes times 2 of cache-coherent hardware-supported shared memory. And that's supported by a global reference unit, or GRU, that's optimized for very fine-grained cache line communications. And so cache line is the smallest a Xeon can handle anyway, so that's as good as you can do in Xeon space. And so Blacklight lets us do a lot of this. The other thing I want to add here is it supports a full range of programming models, including C++ and Java, which is what people tend to write graph applications in these days. And so between the optimized hardware and the programming models that graph developers are writing in, it really was, for quite a while, a singular machine for doing large-scale graph analytics. It's what projects like NEL have been running on, Never-Ending Language Learner, other machine learning applications that leverage GraphLab. GraphLab scaled nicely there to over 1,000 processors or cores. It's a very nice machine for that. As an example, on slide 46 here, this is collaborative filtering. This is a team led by Danny Bixen and others at Carnegie Mellon in the Knowledge Discovery Cup. And in this competition, they placed 5th out of over 1,000 teams. And exactly where you place, that's determined by a bunch of things. It's algorithms, it's a lot going in there. But only by access to the Blacklight machine were they able to do so well in that competition. And that was due to those hardware optimizations that allowed GraphLab to run extremely well there. The second machine I want to talk about is Sherlock. This is a new machine at PSC. And we're actually having a launch for Sherlock on February 1st. So if you go to the PSC webpage, there are also invitations floating around. You'll see that there will be ways to connect to that. And we'll have a symposium in the afternoon with a series of actually very good talks on the cutting edge of graph analytics. So Sherlock is a new system. It's produced by Yark Data, which is a division, well, it's a Cray company. It is called Eureka. Eureka is the Universal RDF Integration Knowledge Appliance. And whatever that means, we'll see. The point of this, though, is that Sherlock couples Cray next generation XMT processors. And these are Threadstorm4 processors. What makes these different from commodity x86 processors is that each Threadstorm supports 128 hardware threads. And that's full registers, full everything you need for a hardware thread. And the C-Star ASIC and C-Star, you know from other Cray machines, both of these have support for remote memory access, for doing fine-grained locking, and providing a single shared address space. Now, the single address space is critical because, as we've seen, big graphs cannot be partitioned, and the algorithms also cannot be easily distributed. So Sherlock, as it stands, has 1 terabyte of globally shared memory. The encoding of graphs is reasonably concise. Each node, each vertex, takes about 100 bytes. And so a terabyte lets us hold graphs about 10 billion edges. And that's certainly more than enough for researchers to make a good start. I only have one researcher who's coming on who has graphs bigger than that at this time. In addition, we've also added XT5 nodes to allow for heterogeneous applications. This is an NSF STCI project, and it's an experimental system. It's for the community to gain experience with this novel graph architecture on cutting-edge research. So we're looking at several things with it. One is doing complex analytics with Eureka. Now, Eureka is really an RDF appliance. It's designed by York Data to serve RDF and SPARQL. We also plan, and we have people who want to do the structural characterization, all the statistics we talked about at the beginning of this talk, and other things in graph dynamics. And so a lot of this is the long tail of research. It's what novel and innovative projects in XSEDE is all about. And many of these communities are people who can use this sort of machine. Look at novel graph problems at full scale, and look at new types of applications that people have not addressed yet because they haven't had machines big enough to do it. Now, Eureka focuses on these Web3 standards. That's RDF and SPARQL in particular. It has an optimized Jenna engine on it, and one typically, for production, would build application-specific graphical user interfaces to deal with big data. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the hardware because we're running out of time. The Threadstorm processor, like I said, has 128 threads. That's what makes it unique. And in each cycle, you can execute 3 instructions. You could do arithmetic, you could do branching, and you could do memory. There's a separate memory unit that provides the single address space. It spans the whole machine and gives you this logically distributed, logically shared but physically distributed memory space. The machine's actually scalable to 512 terabytes. So if you can afford the memory, you can build the biggest shared memory machine there is. There are additional bits to support things that are very important for graphs, like full empty bits. And you need those to be able to do, basically to write on a given word only when it becomes available, and to read only when it becomes full, without burdening the interconnection network with additional memory traffic. And it has a number of techniques built in to avoid hotspots. So for instance, if many different threads want to access the same memory unit, you don't want them all thrashing on the network while they wait to get access to that word. A very brief example is from our collaborators in York Data, and it's actually from the Cancer Research Institute, looking at the graphs when you intersect literature sources of genomics data with experimental data. And the point here is that you have people who are working in genomics in cancer who know about certain genes. They know what genes those may be connected to, but they don't necessarily know what other connections there are between those outlying genes that may be implicated in related diseases or in other things. Right now, the framework that has been built up deals with PubMed data. There is a simple natural language extraction that assigns genes from the literature, and that compared to experimental data. So overall, it's about 6 billion triples or 6 billion edges in the graph, obviously quite large. The graph is very highly connected. This is just one node in all its connections, where the query was limited to 400 connecting nodes. And in general, so this is about 6 billion edges. each node on average has approximately 400 edges. That gives you an idea of how hard it would be to partition. It just can't be done. And the use case here is discovering what the pathways are that connect different genes and what else is connected. And so in this case, actually, something was lost in the green bar here of the other gene. This list of other genes are connected here. And so this is a case where other implications were discovered by looking at these outlying connections within this very complex graph. The ways we expect to use Sherlock are really three things. One is as this RDF SPARQL data appliance, where people transform their data to RDF and work out with SPARQL, and can very productively, very quickly, literally just takes minutes to get your data into this format, provided it's of what people usually work with. And that's one. For people who want to go further, though, we have many use cases where people will be writing native C or C++ applications that will use the Threadstorm processors, these graph analytic platform nodes as they're called, as a graph analytic engine. Think of it as a big graph accelerator. And it's basically a threaded programming model. And there will also be use cases where we have heterogeneous applications, where much of the application runs on the XT5 nodes. And in that case, that can use anything. That could be scripting languages like Python or Perl. It could be Java. It could be Fortran. It could be anything. And then where graph kernels are kicked over to the Threadstorm processors for the graph-specific parts. An example of that would be a genome sequence assembly application where you don't want to port all of the scripting and all of the setup, but the actual de Bruijn graph build and traversal is something you want to execute on the Threadstorm nodes. And so there are other applications there for being heterogeneous. In summary, and so I'm a couple minutes over, this is all about enabling researchers. And so what we have now is new hardware and software that really has never existed before. And it's letting people attack graph analytic problems at full scale, not just toy problems, not just what they can do. And XSEDE can help in several ways. First is by disseminating information about these hardware and software resources that now exist, and establishing best practices. So what works best for different scientific domains and on what platforms. Data modeling is new to a lot of researchers. So we talked about RDF, and we mentioned ontologies, but how does one actually express that most effectively is partially an art. And helping users model their data in ways that lets them get the most power from it and is flexible and not a dead end is an area where we can help. People will want to develop workflows for both exploratory and routine analytics. These workflows will involve other things. They'll involve traditional HPC. It will involve other types of data-intensive computing. It will involve visualization and moving data around. Maybe experimental data. It will involve a lot of things. There will be a stage where people want to do this in an exploratory sense and figure out how they want to do things and what they want to look for. And then there will be a stage where they want to do it operationally and may do data assimilation. They may routinely get data in and want to generate new results from that. There will be many occasions where we will have to scale and optimize graph applications and algorithms. Sherlock and Blacklight both present opportunities where the existing software has been community open source things, but it's been developed by people who didn't have such big systems. And so some scaling work has to be done. And we've been doing that kind of thing here for quite a few years now to fairly excellent success. And so I'm confident we can keep on moving forward and do even more of it and bring in more types of users. Looking to the future, I think people will increasingly want to exploit large-scale graph analytics as part of their research. They're realizing it, they're becoming aware of what is possible and what all they can do. And what you can do on a single memory system, people are starting to hit those limits. And like I said, it's complementary to what they're doing in other aspects of XSEDE. Overall, I think this is a great opportunity for us to add value. It's a part where the computer science and the analytics has been advancing, and that has been concurrent but largely independent of the scientific domains. And by bringing these together, I think we add a lot of value and allow XSEDE to contribute beyond what researchers would do otherwise. So I'm going to stop there. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them.
Nick, thank you very much for an outstanding talk. Let me unmute the phone lines here a moment.
Presentation mode is now disabled.
I'm really glad that we recorded this talk, and I'm really glad that we gave you an hour for it. This was a tremendous overview from starting with a description of graph analytics to ending with what kind of actual platforms in XSEDE are well suited for this type of work. Lots of specific examples, lots of web links where people can go play with things on their own. I thought this was a tremendous talk. Thank you very much. Let me open the floor for just a minute. Questions from anyone on the line for Nick? I think one thing that I've found interesting with RDF and SPARQL and things like that, from the gateway perspective, gateways making use of data that's presented on another gateway, so kind of cross-gateway dependencies. And I've always thought that this is a direction some projects might go in the future, and you provided a very good example of how you might actually do that in real life.
Absolutely, Nancy. That would be an excellent application, because the gateways could very easily publish data as one option, perhaps, as RDF. By doing that, they could interchange data freely. They could discover what the other gateways can present, and the data at that point really becomes reusable. It becomes self-describing. It can have an ontology built or attached to it, and so it would really add value to those gateways. It would mean that once you write a gateway, that other uses downstream that you haven't even anticipated, and then pick up on its output and repurpose it.
Yeah, exactly. Tremendous opportunities. Yep. Yeah, very nice. Who do you think is doing some of the leading work in graph analytics? I mean, industry, advertising folks looking for networking and who buys what and this and that. Is that kind of cutting edge?
It's across the board. Absolutely. The people. You won't find anyone who is more aggressive in this than the folks out there like Google and Facebook and eBay and Netflix and Amazon. I mean, all recommender systems, all of those are based on very large-scale graph analytics. Systems at Google like Priggle have evolved to service this. So absolutely, they're doing outstanding work in the industry. However, most of that work remains proprietary. That's how they make their money. And so a lot of that doesn't make it out. Some of the tools do, but not all of them. In terms of academia, there's a lot of good work going on. It's at Carnegie Mellon, it's at Alberta, it's at Toronto. I'm sure various other it's at Indiana. Andrew Lumsdane's did a lot of good graph analytic work. There's a lot going on.
Great, thank you, Nick.
So what I've tried here, though, is to bring in some of the leading tools. I regret that I only had an hour. There are other things like graph databases and things like Neo4j that can be leveraged. I think academia is catching on with it. I think the tool developers have built some pretty good tools. I think domain researchers, though, just need to have a little bit of an introduction to what tools are out there and how to use them.
Yeah, I agree. We look forward to seeing some ECSS projects in the area, in this area. There's a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. Liwen Shi, who's one of our Campus Champion Fellows, asked about the terminology for calling these things networks rather than graphs. Do you see those things as being interchangeable?
Yeah, they are. So one sees graphs and complex networks as essentially being synonymous. And which it's referred to just depends on the field. Graph has a little bit of a more mathematical connotation, but in practice, like when I talk about graphs, you can use complex networks for all of this. It becomes interchangeable. Another thing I've not addressed at all is dynamics of complex networks. So for many things, we want to look at how processes evolve over networks over time. An example of that is epidemiology, where the complex network in that case is all the people in a city or country and how they move about and what they do and how they cross paths and the dynamics of diseases as they percolate through that network. So yeah, that's Lee Wen's point is very well made. Complex networks is something that it's synonymous.
Yeah, fascinating area. Finally, Christopher asks, we have recorded this. I will. It's on the regular symposium website is where the recording will show up, probably later on today, maybe tomorrow. Nick, if you can send me the slides, I'll get those up there as well, and then people can go through the slides, more slowly, stop your talk and read through it. But several comments about what an excellent presentation this was. So thank you once again. I think with that, I'll let everyone go. Nick's contact information will also be on the symposium website, so you could send him follow-up questions offline. But thanks for a tremendous talk, Nick, and thanks everyone for joining and staying late also.
Okay, thank you everybody. I'm sorry I went over time.
No, great talk. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye everyone.